Cortisol. It's become a commonplace term in the last few years, serving as pop culture shorthand for simply existing in a stressful world. Thrown around like therapy speak, blamed for everything from abdominal weight gain, which is cortisol belly in social media speak, to a puffy face or cortisol face on social media. This makes it really easy to blame cortisol for ruining our health, our lives, and our bodies. But the truth is that we need cortisol. It's what got you and me up this morning. Today, we are getting into this hormone everyone loves to hate. I'm naturopathic Dr. Hussain, and this is Face to Face, the Hormone Health Show. If I'm being honest, I do think that nervous system dysregulation is quite prevalent in women. We juggle a lot of responsibility, often paired with perfectionism. Grind culture, capitalism tells us to do more. We're bombarded with news, geopolitical strife, economic instability, the lack of social infrastructure. Then there's hormone change and a busy lifestyle that really leaves very little room for rest, relaxation, and connection. And all of that takes a really big toll on us, especially if we're under-resourced. And this is where cortisol enters the chat. But the full picture isn't really represented in the online space. So today we're going to talk about what cortisol actually does, when testing is appropriate, why high-intensity exercise is not the enemy, and how we can start to put some supports in place for your nervous system in a world that glorifies hustle culture. Joining me today to have this conversation is Dr. Jordan Robertson. She's a naturopathic doctor and founder of a SaaS company called the Confident Clinician, supporting all aspects of evidence-based integrative care. She is a mentor to many, including myself. She actually appears in the acknowledgement section of my book, and I have a very deep love for her and the way she champions naturopathic
Thanks so much
medicine.
for having me. I felt a little emotional listening to that introduction, so thank you.
I will happily share my love for you anytime. Before we dive into the physiology and all the bits and pieces of cortisol, I would love to know a little bit more about your journey and your thought process, because you've evolved from being a patient-facing clinician to founding the Confident Clinician and mentoring other clinicians. And you really champion evidence-based medicine in a world that really likes fads and trends. Has that changed your views on viral health trends? And what drives you to be that voice of reason for integrative
Big
health?
ones right out of the gate. So my background is in critical appraisal, and that is like the most boring way to introduce yourself, but that is what my sort of introduction to health and integrative medicine actually was, is through the lens of which research belongs in clinical practice. And that question is maybe the question that we should be asking as clinicians every single day that we show up to work. And yet, in my experience, it's not one that is asked very often in the integrative medicine space. When we look at conventional medicine, and I am the first one to say that sometimes guidelines are not keeping up with current research. It takes 5 or more years for organizations to build consensus-based statements around how we feel about new concepts. And for people that are struggling with a particular health condition, that can feel like it's, not meeting the mark. If a brand new study came out on something that was really going to impact your pain or your fertility, you would want it to be put into practice immediately. The flip side of that, though, is that not every study that gets published should change the way we practice medicine. Where we struggle in integrative medicine is which papers should change the way we practice medicine. And we've always had disagreement about that. And we've always really left it up to each individual practitioner to make that decision. I am a huge proponent that if we're a regulated health profession as naturopathic doctors, it should not be buyer beware, meaning that it matters who you see. I want consistency of care across all practitioners that are under an umbrella organization or under an umbrella title. And so my journey has been, how can I help clinicians feel like we're practicing from more consensus and less cherry picking studies that align with our personal bias, which is why we started building the Confident Clinician. And so that became my life's mission. The challenge we have in integrative medicine is that we are up against wellness culture, and we're up against, I'm going to argue, the most amount of medical misinformation in any medical subspecialty. Maybe some cardiologist wants to fight me on that, but I truly believe that we have to go to battle with misinformation more often than the average clinician, because many of our interventions are over the counter. It's accessible to the average person. And there's a lot of like degree confusion around who actually is the expert in this space. So I forget what your question was, but like my feeling around who's like our responsibility as clinicians to show up online and to counter medical misinformation, like it's so vital, because this is the area that patients actually have the most access to doing their own health stuff, because everything is available to them over the counter. They can't like hack their health with a prescription medication, but they could try and hack their health with alpha lipoic acid. So the medical misinformation is more problematic in this field because everything is available. What was your question?
You actually did answer my question. We have just so much information accessible to everybody to be able to discern what's real, what's not real, who does this information apply to and who does it not. And things get really confusing, especially if you don't have that background. And I do know that myself, as well as a lot of our colleagues, we are constantly answering questions that have been brought in from social media. And that's essentially what we're talking about today, because cortisol has been misrepresented in the online space so much. You've got to lower your cortisol. It's probably your cortisol. Can you explain what cortisol's job actually is?
I appreciate cortisol from like its clinical perspective much more than I do from like a biochemistry perspective, which funnily, when we start to look at the like clinical implications of cortisol, like there's not a lot. And so like aside from like the ends of the spectrum of some serious autoimmune diseases, for the average person, their cortisol it's not actually having a negative impact on their health at all. It's actually unrelated to most of the things that are going on with you, which, that's not doing a great job of countering the misinformation we hear, because it's quite compelling, right? It is a stress hormone. Sure, it's physiologically there to help mount a response when there is a demand that's placed on the body. And even like recently, I'm doing work for Confident Clinician on COVID and upper respiratory tract infections. Cortisol goes up when we get sick because it's part of what activates our immune system in a way that allows for an appropriate response. It's doing that like moment to moment, day to day, hour to hour, to ensure that whatever the demand is, whether it's physiological or psychological, hormonal, that your body is actually capable of mounting that response. And so it's connected to our immune system, to inflammation. It's connected to blood sugar regulation, maybe most notably, because your body is trying its hardest to keep things well despite the changing outdoor environment, right? And I don't just mean temperature. I mean all the things that are happening on the outside and the perceptions that your body is experiencing. Cortisol is part of that early response to start to maintain homeostasis or maintain balance inside the body through various regulation mechanisms. But that's about it, right? That is its response. And in wellness culture, we can get hyper fixated on sort of the biological plausibility of things and how arrows connect in the body and things that are like related. But there's lots of things that are related but not causal, right? Like there's always that example of like, we eat the most ice cream in the months that there's the most shark attacks. And so ice cream obviously causes shark attacks. The cortisol conversation is often likened to that, where it's elevated in times of physiological distress. It's not causing the distress. It's not causing a long-standing disease by it being there. It is around, it is there, it is present during a lot of distressful things that happen in the body, but it's not causing them. But because it actually meets a lot of eligibility criteria for being a famous hormone, right? It's like, it's related to stress, physiologically related to glucose and adiposity. But that doesn't mean that it's causing your weight gain, but it's physiologically connected. Again, celebrity status now, that this is going to be something that you can buy a starter pack and start taking supplements to try and make it go away. But the actual fact is that it is unrelated to any of those conditions. It is so variant person to person that it's actually not a reliable lab test at all. And only in the extreme cases do we think that it's actually having a negative impact on health. And that's where we would intervene, right? Like with medication and what have you. But it does meet a lot of that criteria that the wellness culture will latch on to and then try and exploit as something that you've done that's wrong or something that you need to fix, or you need to buy something to fix your cortisol.
Totally. It's a player in the body doing its job sort of situation. If you have an outright adrenal disorder where it can be dysregulated, in which case, to your point, we intervene and we test appropriately to figure out what's going on. But the majority of cases, especially as they're presented online, we are conflating some of the things that happen when we're stressed out and the cortisol doing its thing in the background with one another. Do you think there are some things about cortisol that the wellness culture does get right?
I mean, if we took out the word cortisol and we replaced it with the word uh, under-resourced, or if we replaced it with the concept of resiliency building or allostatic load, we would be an awful lot closer to the truth. But by naming that one biochemical thing and then saying all those things about it, I'm not sure that anything that we're saying online is correct. The thing that I do the most rabbit holing on in my career right now is looking at how we build capacity in patients from a mental health perspective, from a physiological perspective. I love looking at the research on capacity building because I actually think that this is maybe the root of this entire discussion. And we have labeled one hormone as being the villain, and the villain is like the life we lead right now. And, not to mention all of the villains that you commented on in the opening of this discussion. Those are really the villains, right? Not the one little hormone that elevates for like 90 seconds when you burn your hand. Like, that's really not the one that we should be placing blame on. And so if wellness culture got it right, because sometimes the solutions aren't wrong. Eat better, go to bed, right? Like, I love the hack your bedtime conversation. If everyone did that, we'd be better. Exercise, resistance training, get hormone therapy. I love a lot of the solutions that we're talking about, like general wellness wise, because what that is doing is capacity building. I want you to have a gratitude journal. I want you to have all those things. The solutions aren't necessarily wrong. You don't need a supplement for your cortisol. But that concept, what we're saying we're fixing with that is not cortisol, right? What we're doing with that is building like cognitive capacity for stress. We're probably raising a bar or a threshold point at which our body perceives things as stressful, and we increase resources so that when you are stressed, you have a bank account that you're pulling from versus you're pulling from empty. So wellness culture gets some, 80% of the answers right, but they are talking about the wrong target as being the reasons that you're doing those things. So maybe they're getting a little bit right. We'll give them a little bit.
Yeah, and I would also give them the point for helping some people identify that they actually have an adrenal disorder underlying. But that doesn't apply to the majority of cases. That's like a small piece of that whole conversation. Can we go back to defining the concepts you laid out? One is allostatic load.
Yeah. So, I mean, this idea of allostatic load, and where we've studied it the most is actually in athletes. But I think a lot of the athlete literature should be applied more freely and liberally to the general population, because we will study the shit out of them to figure out how to get them 1% better. And then we'll be like, oh, that one was just in rowers. Like, no one else needs to listen to this. If we can make a rower 1% better, imagine what would happen if we took some of those general concepts and actually applied them to the general population, right? Like, I think the translation of literature, some literature from athlete to average person would really help us out quite a bit, especially when we talk about the stress response on the body during exercise, because they are the perfect example of allostatic load and the perfect example of how we build resource and capacity in a human being so they can reach their potential. But the perfect example is, and I always say this when I was talking to patients about it, it's like if we put people up on the podium at the Olympics, They eat the same, they train the same, they have the same coaches a lot of the time, right? They train at the same facility, and one woman can have her period and the other woman could lose her period under those same circumstances. When we look at those variables, like technically all the ins were the same, all the outs were the same, but the outcome was different, right? One of those women's bodies perceived the training and the intensity and the maybe energy availability from nutrition to be threatening enough that it actually shut down menstruation. And the other woman's body is like, we're good. And that's a perfect example to sort of like open the conversation around allostatic load, is that there are individual variances in terms of how our bodies perceive a stressor, and our response is going to be slightly different depending on our own internal capacity for those stressors. So in athletes, we talk about it in terms of like energy availability and menstrual function specifically, but we also talk about it in athletes in terms of things like immune function, because again, the same runners in a running group could do the same amount of running, and one person gets like 8 respiratory tract infections per year and someone else doesn't. It's the same stimuli, but one person's immune function is suppressed by it and another person's isn't. So there are some variables that we know that can actually improve or increase that your body's capacity for stressors. And lots of them are the basic foundations of health, right? Like when we talk about athletes, usually they are doing everything perfectly and we're trying to get the top 1%. But when we look at the average person, and you need to be resourced to do tax season or to write your kids' report cards for your class, now there's a demand or a stressor on your body, but the resources that are available to your body are going to be depleted by that. And your capacity is your own, right? You build it with sleep and nutrition and mindset and not being deficient in a whole bunch of nutrients. You build your own internal capacity, and it allows for this allostasis, which is a little different than homeostasis, and it's that your body can rise to meet the demands that is required of it. So I love talking about it because this is partly where we see individual variations under the same distress. And it accounts for a lot of the inter-individual variability in terms of like why someone may feel well under one circumstance and someone may not in another. But it also puts a lot of like positive ownership on patients to do that level of like resource building in themselves, to see where they can increase their own capacity so that they actually may be able to handle higher stressors or just their own stressors with like a better resourced body. So that's what allostatic load is. It's like moment to moment, your brain is trying to decide if it has the resources available to deal with the demand, whatever that is. Cortisol is part of that buffering system. So even when you get sick, cortisol jumps in to help you be able to meet that demand. When we resource a patient with the sleep and all of the things required, then their tolerance for and their capacity for stress actually goes up. So that's what that term like allostatic load is. If we replaced that in the conversation around cortisol online, we'd get closer to being right about it.
You talked about translating some of those concepts from athletes to a more average population, because athletes, to your point, do a very good job of like having those foundations really dialed in, and then we go in and layer in smaller things or individualize things on top. This is where I think sometimes things get lost in translation, like where we are starting at the individual tiny things and forgetting or not paying as much attention to the bigger things, the building blocks that lay down that foundation and make you feel a little bit more settled. It's sometimes, I think, also easier in this day and age to take a supplement than be like, okay, I need to put away my phone X amount of time before bed, and I need to actually think about breakfast if I'm going to put something in my mouth before 12 p.m. hits and not just run on empty. Like we have this conversation in clinic so often. I'm so tired at 2 p.m. I'm just exhausted. And we go through what they've eaten in the day. And it's like a coffee and a banana and maybe some leftovers from when they were making their kids' lunches. That's what they're running on. And they also manage to fit in some exercise. But we've created an insurmountable fuel deficit here that no matter what you do, you're going to feel tired because that ball has already started rolling down the hill. And you can't really catch up until sort of like the day resets almost.
Yeah, and we have, I mean, in wellness culture, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in wellness culture. But there was something that you were saying there, like around how we'll extrapolate, the top 1%, the data on the top 1% and say, well, you should take rhodiola for your stress. Like that's not wrong, but it's like it is a cherry on top of like a really messy sundae if you do not actually have the other parts in there. When we're giving this to Olympic athletes, like they're doing all the other stuff correctly. So like do that other stuff first. That's how we build the capacity for the rhodiola to even do the thing. But we'll say we want total health and wellness, but then we want to blame one hormone and we want to take one supplement, right? Like we can't have it both ways. If we want to be acknowledged that like health and wellness is a whole body experience and we want our whole story to be heard by our doctor, we have to be willing for our whole story to be the reason we're at the doctor and actually like listen to some of the things that we might be doing on a daily basis that aren't repleting our resiliency or are in fact depleting our resiliency, because there's like both of those, to get the thing we want, right? The thing we want is to be symptom free. And so I'm glad you called that out, because I like the athlete data from like a fueling, exercise, mindset perspective. The moment we start adding supplements, I'm like, no, like don't add that to the whole general population. They don't need it. But what we do need is to take some of the idea around capacity building that we do in athletes, where we do intentional load, intentional distress, intentional rest, intentional fueling, periodized exercise. Like we do all these things in athletes. And then in the average person, we think that those same concepts don't apply. You have to have intentional stressors, intentional load on your stress system, intentional hard stuff so that you can actually learn to cope and thrive, intentional discomfort. We need all of that to build resiliency. And this is where I'm going to get a little bit controversial. I've watched the discussion around women and stress in the last 5 years say women need to say no, do less, lie on the floor. Like, that is actually not how we build resiliency in women. No, the cognitive load that women have is unfair and does need to be reexamined. But the things that actually would help women thrive is actually letting them have like intentional stressor and intentional work towards building resiliency, not removing all of the things that cause stress. So that's my like total soapbox moment about that.
That intentional modifier, it does change everything. We have so much unintentional pressures, unfortunately, from the world around us and the demands and the structures that we have. This is a great segue into my next question about high intensity exercise. There is a time and place for high intensity exercise, and I would say it exists in pretty much everyone's lives, because that intentional stressor improves our cardiovascular disease risk. It improves our longevity. Longevity has been in the news quite a bit recently. That's how growth happens too, right? Like growth doesn't happen through ease typically. It comes with hardship and moving through that. And the better supported you are through that, the better you come out on the other end, versus like burnout on the other end. It makes a difference. So let's go back to that exercise piece, because here is where I get women in my practice and they literally say, I love running, but I'm worried about my hormones. I feel confused, so I have stopped exercising. Period. Which is like so heartbreaking and irksome simultaneously, because we've demonized this really beneficial and beautiful form of exercise that actually has benefits on our health. Can you speak to that in cortisol?
It's funny. My daughter just asked me, because she started in the gym at school, and now I'm getting all the misinformation from like the high school gym home. This is a new experience for me. And I'm letting her like learn some of the, like be in the culture of it and like, figure some stuff out. And then she'll bring me some questions. And she mentioned something the other day, like, if we trained legs yesterday, if we train legs today, then they won't grow, right? Like just, you see these like little, like these like ideas that have been stemmed from, and it's the same idea, right? This is the same concept that like, there is a point at which exercise is bad. And I said to Charlie, I was like, kiddo, like you should exercise as much as humanly possible that you can recover from. That's really the answer. You can exercise as hard and as often as you can, as long as you can recover from it. And if you make that the variable or the ceiling, then all of a sudden it really opens up a lot of possibility, because if you can't recover from it, that's the problem. But when we have people who can recover from their exercise that are now limiting their exercise for some like perceived threat reason, that's a huge problem. Like, we had a really hard time getting you to exercise in the first place from a public health initiative perspective, and now you're not going to exercise. This is like literally what we're trying to fix and get everyone to do. But you can train as much as you can recover from. And what does recovery look like? Well, it kind of depends on your sport, but like excess fatigue or, excess soreness. And I'm not talking about a little bit of soreness that you could just warm up through. I'm saying like you're debilitated by it. If it starts to affect your daily function the next day, then you didn't recover from it. But most people, the average person, is so below the threshold of their exercise being unrecoverable from that this should not even enter the chat at all. I rarely work with people ever who were exercising so much that we had to have a conversation about recovery. Now, I've put myself through periods of exercise where I did not recover, but I'm like mildly crazy when it comes to some of those pieces, like in a very good way. And have done the like over exercising, immune suppression, over exercising, under fueling for a weight cut, lost my period. Like, I have played on that side of it. And even training 5 days or 6 days a week myself, I cannot get myself to that place of exercising too much. It takes this additional stressor of caloric restriction or life stress or something else to get to that point for me. And so the number of times that the average person is playing with fire when it comes to their exercise is so low that if we make people feel fear around their exercise, we are doing a massive disservice, especially for women who have so many barriers to exercise in the first place. And now we're like trying to make you figure out what the perfect amount is and the perfect intensity and the perfect time of your cycle. Like, again, just shoot us, because we've been spending our whole careers trying to get people to exercise. And now the wellness culture is like, oh, but don't do too much.
Totally. We're trying to find the perfect way to exercise when the answer is please exercise. Let's start with getting you to move in whatever way is possible. And if you want to run, let's run. This cortisol conversation is such a funny one, because actually, if we think about long-term adaptability, the high intensity exercise actually helps. It improves our resilience in the long run. Now I'm going to ask you about testing. When, if at any time, is cortisol testing appropriate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for the average person who does not have an autoimmune disease that's affecting their adrenal glands, there is not really a reason to test cortisol. The like high exception to that would be if you are like, health is your hobby and you are a super health hacker and you want to take your cortisol every single day to like map out, like if you honestly wanted to look at that, maybe one day you would have enough individualized data for you to understand something about your stress response. But the reason I say it that way is that, like, if we lined up 100 people and they all had the same symptoms, everyone's cortisol would be different. So it's not helpful to connect with their symptoms, right? Even if we were pretty sure their symptoms were stress related, everyone's cortisol would be different. Also, if we subjected the same 100 people to the same stressor, everyone's cortisol at the end of that stressor would be different. So if we like shoved all of you on stage to give a presentation, everyone's cortisol would be different. And then you would say, yeah, Jordan, but for some people that presentation wasn't stressful and for some people it was. And you're like, yeah, that's the point, right? Like, we can't use it to help us understand your stressors. We can't use it to understand your symptoms. And we can't use it to track your recovery. So for lab tests, they need to like tell us something we don't already know. They need to change your treatment, or they need to be part of a monitoring process for your treatment. And cortisol does not meet any of those recommendations. The other challenge we have is that when people are exposed to repeated stressors, okay, so we pushed you on stage, some of you gave a great speech, some of you really struggled, some of you found it stressful, some of you didn't. And if tomorrow we push you all on stage again, Some of your bodies will actually say, oh, we did this yesterday. We don't need quite as much cortisol. Some of your bodies will be like, oh my God, we did this yesterday. Make all sorts of cortisol, and you'd make more. And some of your bodies would just be like the same amount of cortisol. So again, even repeated stressors, inter-individual variability is so high that it becomes an irrelevant lab test. My one exception of like the person who wants to spend $1 billion tracking their own cortisol, maybe one day you would have enough of your own data to be like, hey, cool, this is interesting. You know, during this really interesting period of my life, my cortisol was a little higher or it was a little lower. But it's like as good of like as wearable data, right? Where you could like watch your own cortisol, but we can't medically make any recommendations based off of it. You would just be following it along like as this cool thing. Most people who are seeking out a test are not doing it just to like throw money in a bonfire and check out a cool thing. You're doing it because you think it's correlated to your symptoms. You think it's going to give you answers, and you think it's going to be part of monitoring. And it's none of those things, unfortunately. Now, that said, many adrenal crises on both directions, like for patients who have Cushing's or patients who have Addison's, historically have been found in emergency situations because patients don't know that they have these severe and sometimes life-threatening conditions until they're in the hospital. Do I wish that we could catch people a little earlier? Yes, but that doesn't come from screening everyone. It actually comes from the clinicians who are looking at patients who are presenting with some of those concerning symptoms that may be related to Addison's, and to actually be mindful of that as a potential differential diagnosis for patients. I wish that people didn't have to go to the hospital to get diagnosed with Addison's, but that is the most common place we catch people right now. But it doesn't mean that the average person needs to have their cortisol checked because they can't fall asleep or because they're having other symptoms that they think are related to stress.
And what other tests are appropriate when people are feeling like anxious or they are having hair loss? If we think about the symptoms that have been associated with cortisol, it's going to be fatigue, anxiety, headaches, sluggishness, irritability. What kinds of tests would be appropriate in that case?
Yeah, like first of all, making sure that you're up to date on all of your general screening, right? Like we do screening for a reason because it catches people at like super opportune times to make a difference. Things like iron deficiency, which is just endemic and also related to many of those same symptoms, is incredibly important. Screening for thyroid, like getting caught up on your actual medical screening is incredibly valuable. I am a huge proponent of sleep studies for patients that have the daytime sleepiness that's like otherwise can't be understood, like having PCOS or being overweight or et cetera. I'm a fast prescriber for sleep study because it's easy, it's accessible, and it is something that we can't discern without the test. So we can't guess if you have sleep apnea. We can't guess if you have restless leg. You need to go and be assessed for it. And so I pull the trigger on that one early and probably earlier than the guidelines even suggest, honestly, because I like swung the pendulum really far the other way. Historically, we just don't screen women, and historically we send people for that test. And yet the more information we learn about sleep apnea, the more often we should be testing. So that one's always high on my list, especially if people have like unexplained fatigue. But a lot of the other things come down to like pattern recognition in your day and your life and in your nutrition and your sleep. So, usually when we get people to pay attention or notice some of these pieces, kind of like you alluded to earlier, like if you get your second wind after dinner, like that was your first wind and you should have just had breakfast. Like there are these patterns that are happening in people's day-to-day lives that are probably connected to the way that they feel. But again, because of our bias or because we've normalized those patterns, we don't necessarily see them as connected. And yet, if you have a great conversation with a third party, they may be able to point their finger at underfueling or overcaffeinating or something that maybe is just having a side effect that is causing fatigue. Caffeine's not a problem, but people often will undereat if they have too much caffeine. But those kinds of like that pattern recognition in your day and life also goes a long way to looking at the like cortisol related symptoms. People will not realize that it's the like them eating out because they're stressed that's causing all the salt retention. Like, it has nothing to do with your cortisol. It's the fact that you, like, got pad thai 3 times last week. Like, that's why you put on 2 kilos of water. But those patterns are hard to see for ourselves. Like, it's so hard. Even I struggle with it, right? Where I'm like, you doing a thing and then you start bitching about it. And then, your workout buddy's like, yeah, but wait, aren't you? And then they say this very obvious thing that you're doing that's getting in the way of your health. Beyond tests, I think that third party look at our patterns of the way we show up for our body and health and mind make a massive difference on how people feel. And that to me is like the testing that really needs to happen here.
I love that. I'm also a big sleep study proponent, like especially because of like the populations I see. I see a lot of PCOS, I see a lot of perimenopause, even high blood pressure. People are like, it might be my cortisol. I'm like, or it could be sleep apnea, right? So I'm pretty quick to send patients for that as well. Now, as we approach the end of our episode together, what are some of the things, and we've talked about them throughout, but as a summary, if someone is having like nervous system dysregulation, that's like my term that I'll use for some of the things that people are coming in with when they think they have high cortisol. And especially it comes up to the surface when people are going through significant hormonal transitions, like perimenopause is a big one, because oftentimes the things that we used to do before no longer are received in the body the same way. And we're also juggling way more. And then there's chronological aging happening on top of that. So what are some of the things, the day-to-day habits that people can start working on and how they can create that resilience to some of the stressor they're experiencing?
That's a really great question. And this is coming from a person who was like a 0 sleep step person to now I think there's 6 or 7 steps now, which I'm like laugh at because I was so resistant, but my own like 44-year-old situation was just not able to sleep anymore. And so now there's like 6 or 7 steps that must happen. Um, yeah, I think, if we think about our resiliency, and I used to describe it this way to patients, when you're really burned out, right, and you really like resources are super low, it feels like you are living inside of almost like an electric fence where any move you make actually gives you a bit of a zap. And it's showing you like that you can't do a lot. If you were going to you're going to exercise and then it takes you longer or more to recover from it than you thought it should, or a small stressor happens and your response to it is like exaggerated because you actually don't have the capacity for it. And what's hard for patients is we've been taught to avoid those bad things or those bad feelings, right? We even see this in like the arthritis literature where we used to tell people to not exercise at all. And actually the treatment is exercise. Like some pain is productive, right? And understanding your limits and understanding your boundaries is productive, not so that we stay within them, so that we learn how to move beyond them, actually. And so if you're in like a very small confined little electric fence where like everything you do is giving you a zap, that's teaching you that like what you've got going on the inside really needs more support. So the basics: sleep, adequate calorie intake, adequate carb intake, hormonally ensuring that there isn't something that needs to be supported there, right? Especially if you're in perimenopause. If there's a nutritional deficiency, like going up a flight of stairs when you have iron deficiency is giving you a zap because it's like daily life is actually quite difficult when those basics are not there. But then when we start to build that capacity, then the goal is actually to start to like push that, that capability and that electric fence out a little further. So it's not running up a flight of stairs that makes you tired, but maybe doing a 15-minute HIIT workout. We start to like actually build capacity where you're able to do more in your same body, which is so cool. And then the goal is to actually continue to figure out where those limits are. And again, we train patients medically to avoid discomfort, avoid pain, avoid the bad thing at all cost. The treatment for burnout is to push the fence out farther by building capacity. And occasionally you like really zap yourself. Like you're like, oh shit, I thought I could handle this and I ran a 10K and I feel like trash. That's okay. Again, we've learned to take that as a sign that you'll never run a 10K again. No, it's like in this current state, that was not an appropriate stressor. if we could just actually take in all the data as data and be like not super emotional about it, I think people would have a more fun time actually trying to approach resiliency building. Like it's a game, right? Like how much can you build up your capacity so that you can do more? What a fun game,
Yeah.
actually, versus thinking like, oh, I have all these limits and I can't do anything and I have to take out all these foods and this hormone's ruining my life. That is not a fun way to approach your health at all. But if you thought about it like you were trying to win by doing the most possible and exercise the most without, without sort of reaching that threshold where now you can't recover, eating the most to keep your body well. Like if we tried to live in that direction instead, people would actually build resiliency and capacity, and then they would never even think about their cortisol because their daily function would be so much better because they're constantly trying to like create inner capacity by doing all of those things. So I love that topic because I think it's just such a fun way to approach health and wellness. You are an N of one experiment. Like, let's figure out how you can like operate at 110%, whatever that means for you. We don't do that by doing less and avoiding stuff and being afraid. We actually do it by being brave, by finding our limits, by trying to push past them, by building resiliency and capacity and being patient. That's how we build that like capacity in patience. And so I think if we could like turn that conversation on its head, healthcare would be a lot more fun and health seeking would be a lot more fun too.
And I think that that lesson can be translated across life, really. You can apply that to business, your finances and saving, your health, exercise capacity. Building any kind of proverbial muscle requires a bit of push and pull, and then you might need to adjust based on where you are in life, and that's all good.
Yeah, I think that stuff's so fun. The only other thing I would maybe add to that is just the reminder that one is not a trend, right? Like one is not a trend. And yet we very often will act after one thing happens to our health or one thing happens in our day or life. You do one thing and then something bad happens and then you never want to do that thing ever again. That is not a trend. That is a coincidence until proven otherwise, right? For lots of instances, especially when we're talking about stress and stressors and capacity building and whatnot. One is not a trend. It's like we need a repeated information to actually understand how to build capacity in someone's body or life. But again, we're often sort of afraid of the pain, the proverbial pain, whatever that is, rather than seeing it as like a ceiling that we want to try and move. We see it as like a stop dead, like we don't go past this. And I think if we again like approach our health a little bit more like an experiment and more fun, then I think we would have an easier time thinking about our own stressors and that capacity building.
Mhm. Thanks, Jordan. That was a really nice reframe of experimentation in our own health, and our tolerance for experimentation is different, right? I think that's part of the issue, and especially if you are someone who's under resourced. Okay, as we end our time together today, here at Phase to Phase, we're very big into learning and growing, and I know that is pretty much what you're all about. So, can you share a concept or strategy that has evolved in your professional experience over time?
Hmm. I mean, for when we practice in medicine, we have to shed a lot of beliefs. I mean, pretty much every 5 minutes, right? Like, I think this idea that anything is nothing's written in blood, right? In medicine, we always have to be willing to change our mind. And that's a skill that I was exposed to early in my development, changing your mind. And I think that's one of my top five, important skills when I think about what it takes to be a great practitioner, but also just a great human is to be so, so, so willing to change your mind when you're faced with new information. We do like sink a lot of relevance into the things we think and then the things we learn. And if we can dissociate from that a little bit and not put so much meaning behind the way we think things are, because especially in medicine, we might be proven wrong by that like by tomorrow. And if I've really wrapped up a lot of my self-worth or my morality or anything connected to what I believe about medicine right now, I'm gonna have a really hard time when new information gets published. And so being able to separate yourself from what you think and believe, especially about health, and being much more curious and open-minded to incorporate new information. That generally helps people in a positive way. Now, don't incorporate new wrong information. Which that's like a totally different conversation. But for me, that like growth mindset for me has always been about like, how can I add here? Like, how can I add to my current understanding of something? And how do I need to edit or upgrade the way that I think about something in order to like continue to be the best practitioner possible?
It's a lesson that we can all take moving forward, especially in this era of medical misinformation online. Putting our critical thinking hats on, not being so defensive. Okay, and where can people find you, connect with you, learn from you, or even join the Confident Clinician?
Yeah, so clinicians that are looking for support in their practice from a clinical decision making perspective, the Confident Clinician is always here for you. We support clinicians with clinical decision making and help you stay up to date without having to do all that work yourself. So you can find us at confidentclinicianclub.com, or you can find us on social media. I like Instagram most of the time, so you can find me there at Dr. Jordan ND.
Jordan, thank you so much for being here. I loved having this conversation with you, and I know that listeners will really benefit from it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, there we have it. The internet loves to hate on it, but we really do need it. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend who is terrified of running or simply is a breathing, living human on planet Earth in 2026. And don't forget to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts or at face2face.ca.